Hi there, and welcome to this module where you are going to learn the basics of user interface design, a really important topic for front-end developers, as users these days really expect high quality from their apps and websites, not only on the functional level, but also on the design side. So UI design is really a tool you want to have in your tool belt. In this module, you're going to go through 3 different sections, starting off with one about UI design fundamentals, or more specifically, the 7 fundamentals. That includes things like typography, colors, visual hierarchy, white space, and so on. Moving on, you're going to experiment with a very simple layout and see how we can get creative even with really strict constraints. I remember watching this section for the very first time and I was blown away by how much you could do even with just a couple of elements on the screen. And then finally, we're tying it all together in a full project refactoring at the end of the module. And to give you a sneak peek of all of this, here is the project you're building in section 2. This is just a very simple article where you're doing a ton of code with a set of strict constraints. And here you can see the project that you'll refactor in section 3. Your teacher for this module will be Gary Simon, whom you might know from YouTube. He's one of the most popular coding and design teachers on YouTube with roughly 1 million followers. And Gary has over 20 years of experience from the industry. He's created over 100 courses, and in this module, he takes all of his knowledge and distills it down to exactly what you need to know as a junior developer. So I really think you'll like this module. And with that, let's just jump into it.
Hello, my name is Gary Simon, and I've been a UI designer and front-end developer for the last 20 years. And some of you may also know me by my YouTube channel, Design Course, which I've ran for the last 10 years. Now, this course is geared towards front-end developers who have at least a basic understanding of HTML and CSS, and that's because we're going to use CSS to realize effective and great-looking UI designs in the browser. Now, the only way to produce good UI designs is by first understanding the UI design fundamentals, and that's exactly what we're going to focus on in this course. And you're going to apply these fundamentals through a variety of interactive examples here on Scrimba. Now, this course is actually just a small sample from my upcoming UI design bootcamp releasing here on Scrimba. The full course will contain hours upon hours of UI design loaded with challenges and interactive examples, all to help you develop the necessary muscle memory to either improve existing designs or to create UI designs from scratch. So refresh this mini browser and click here to leave your email, and you'll get sneak peeks of my upcoming bootcamp. Plus, it will guarantee the very best price when the course launches. So let's get started. Welcome to this lesson where we're going to talk about the first UI design fundamental, which is white space. Now, before we begin, I wanted to note that there isn't one UI design fundamental that's more important than the other. I'm just arbitrarily choosing to start to talk about white space here. So white space, sometimes referred to as negative space, is the empty space between the elements in your user interface. It's very simple. It's just basically a void of space, but that's really what gives your layout structure. So coming over here, we have 2 examples. We have 2 cards, and right now they're designed exactly the same. And there's something wrong with them, and that is, you guessed it, white space or negative space. Now, we could see white space all over the place in the absent areas of these cards. This would be referred to as white space. And in fact, if we're just looking at this layout with 2 cards here in the mini browser, there is good amount of white space between these elements, but what about inside? So we see this very little white space between the text elements and this container, and also between the title and the paragraph. So actually there's 3 areas where we're going to improve the white space, and you're going to see just how much better this ends up looking. So that's why white space is so important. So just taking a quick look at the HTML, there's nothing fancy happening here. We have 2 cards. One of them has a secondary class so that I can target specifically in CSS. So let's hop on over to our index.css here. And all this right here, this CSS, we're not going to worry about. We're going to come down here, and I'm going to target that secondary class in order to improve this card over here in terms of the white space. So the first thing I want to do is to increase the white space that's inside of this container. So I'm going to say secondary, and that will target the card itself. And we're going to say padding. Now, when it comes to defining white space in CSS, the primary properties in this type of context would be padding and margin. Now, there's other ways to define white space using CSS, but we'll get to those later. But for now, it's going to be padding because that's the inside of the element. So what if I just say padding 1 EM? All right. By the way, the M unit is what I suggest using in this type of context for padding. As you could see, we'll see in the future that the font size that's set on the body property, which by default is 16 pixels, when it comes to responsive design, we can simply reset that font size property, and all of our margin using M units and padding and any other element that has the M unit will grow in relation to it. So it is a flexible unit. So we have padding 1M unit, and we can already see it looks quite a bit better. It may not be perfect, but really, I think we can bump it up a notch, even in this context of the mini browser. So we can bump it up to 1.5. That's looking pretty good right there. I would say that's probably around the sweet spot. So I want you to realize that there is a lot of subjectivity in terms of the choices you make in your UI design fundamentals. And certainly that's the case with our white space, but there's also objectivity. This would be, 0 EM would be objectively horrible. I would say this right here, if we choose to go 1.3 all the way up to perhaps 1.9, that's a sweet spot. And let's go ahead also and improve secondary. We'll take our H1 element. And so let's do margin bottom, and we'll say 0.5 EM. All right, so we've also increased the white space and improved it between the title and the paragraph, which looks so much better. Now, there's also white space between the lines of the text, and this is called leading. And the CSS property for that, we'll target the P element, would be line height. Now, by default, we can put at 1 EM, but we need to increase this maybe by about 1.5. So now, overall, this card right here looks so much better. And the only UI design fundamental that we changed is white space. In this lesson, we're going to talk about alignment. So alignment in UI design is the process of ensuring that every element, and that element could be a simple button or piece of type or anything, essentially, is positioned correctly in relation to other elements. Now, that might sound a little bit confusing, but you should have a good idea by the end of this lesson. So let's take a look at an example. So in our mini browser, we can see that we have this user interface. And in terms of all UI design fundamentals, everything's good except one thing, and that is alignment. So we can see that we have really four elements that exist in this UI. We have a logo, we have a headline, we have this element, and then we have this button right here. And they all seem to be off a little bit in terms of their alignment, and it really does throw things quite off. So going back to our code, if I go to the index.css, we'll see I have the regular code to achieve this layout. And then at the bottom here, I have an improvements section right here, and also this column area. Now I'm going to change this alpha opacity to 1 instead of 0. And it's going to show us this column right here. And this column has a border, and you need to think of every element that is in your user interface as having a series of rows and columns. So going back to the slides, each element in the UI user interface as having columns. Rows and columns. So going back to the slides, each element in the UI defines these series of rows and columns. So here's an example that shows both a row extending, so a series of rows and columns. So going back to the slides, each element in a UI defines these series of rows and columns. So here's an example that shows both a row extending out from some company, this first element up here, and a column. Now, if we keep on going on, we'll see that this element, which is the headline, also has a column. And this as well also has a column. So really, we're working with 3 different columns across these 4 different elements. So going back to our code, let's go ahead and try to fix those issues. So I'm just simply going to take this comment out, hit save, and if I toggle this back to 0, we can see now it looks much better because everything is aligned properly in that same column. So just to show you in the slides, we can see now how simplified it becomes when we can visualize each of those columns. And that's why understanding alignment is so important. So going forward throughout this course, we're going to see more complex examples of alignment, both vertically and horizontally through rows and columns. And by the end of it, you should have a solid grasp when it comes to applying alignment in your own UI designs. Welcome to your very first challenge. So in the previous lessons, we discussed white space and alignment. So in this challenge, I'm going to ask you to improve the white space and alignment issues that are presented within these cards. So going to the CSS here, at the bottom, you can see we have this comment here. Use the following properties to fix the alignment and white space issues on the rule sets below this comment. So here's a few of the suggested CSS properties that you can use to fix the issues that are present right here in this mini browser. And below are a few role sets that you can choose to apply some of these properties to in order to fix the issues. So what I'll ask you to do is go ahead and pause right now and then come up with your solution and then hit play, and I'll show you what I would do. Okay, so hopefully you were able to come up with something that fixed these issues. So I'm going to provide you with what I would have done. And just remember, you don't have to do exactly what I do. As long as you are fixing these issues and you're as somewhat close and you're adhering to good white space and alignment fundamentals, then you're good to go. So the first issue I want to address is the lack of white space on the left and right of the mini browser. There is none at all. So that's something that we definitely want to fix because the browser itself is a container. So it's inside of the body content that we need to add the padding. So we're going to use padding here. So we'll say 2EM, and we could see it's done a good job. Now, the content is applied, the content class is applied to this white container right here. All right, so there's a lack of white space inside of that. So we'll use padding to fix that. Padding 1EM should work pretty well. All right. Now we also have some alignment issues. We could see that these two elements are left aligned, but this element right here is centered. Now you have two options. You could choose to center the awesome title and the description right here, or you can left align both of these. So I'm going to choose to left align the date right here. Text align left. All right, that looks good. Now we still have quite a bit of white space between these elements, and I think we can get rid of a little bit of the white space between the awesome title and the date. So on the date selector, we're just going to say margin 0. All right, that's looking, in my opinion, a little bit better. And one issue, we could see the amount of white space that's present from the top of the date and beneath the little thumbnail here, and also to the left. It's equal. But look at the amount of white space beneath the description and the bottom of the container. So there's a lot here, but not very much up here. So one thing that you want to pay attention to is to try to add equal white space inside your containers. So I'm going to take the paragraph description selector, and I'm simply going to add margin bottom 0. So now everything is lined up much better. So this is where I ended up. Again, you don't have to look exactly like this. You could have chose to text align center these, and you could have changed up the white space. Maybe you had more, a little bit more, maybe you had a little bit less. But as long as you overall improved it and you got somewhere in my neighborhood, then you will have done well. Now, if you didn't, don't stress. This is the very first coding challenge. We're at the beginning of the course. We're going to go through so many more of these, and you're really going to start developing that eye. So again, this is where we ended up. This is where we came from. If I just delete these selectors, you can see how it's just so ugly. I'm going to add these selectors back, and now it looks much better. Contrast is defined as being in a strikingly different state from something else. Every element in a user interface by nature has a certain amount of contrast based on the background that's behind it. So this is true for button text that's positioned on a button background. It's true for the button background that's positioned on a card, and it's true for the card that's positioned on a layout. Now, the WCAG, which is an acronym for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, 2.0 color contrast guidelines are there to ensure that your type-based elements on your layout are accessible to those with vision impairment issues. So there are two variations, the minimum and then the enhanced. The minimum is referred to as AA, and it's simply the visual presentation of text and images of text has a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, except for large text, which should have a contrast ratio. ratio of at least 3:1. The enhanced version is the same exact thing, except the baseline contrast ratio should be 7:1 instead of the previous 4.5:1, and large text should be at least 4.5:1 instead of the 3.0:1 previously. So you may be wondering, how do I know how my elements are contrasting? Well, there are browser plugins for Chrome and Firefox. If you simply just search for WCAG contrast plugin or something like that, you'll find them. There are websites where you can place in the different values. And then there's UI design application plugins such as Sketch and Figma and Adobe Experience Design. So let's go ahead and check out an example. In the mini browser, we can see that we have this very simple layout with this hero section with a headline, subheadline, and the button. So there's hardly any contrast with this element right here. It's quite a bit harder to read out with place in the different values. And then there's UI design application plugins such as Sketch and Figma and Adobe Experience Design. So let's go ahead and check out an example. In the mini browser, we can see that we have this very simple layout with this hero section with a headline, subheadline, and the button. So there's hardly any contrast with this element right here. It's quite a bit harder to read than up here. And also, there's not enough contrast in the Explore Now button. In fact, I checked out what the color contrast ratios were between these two elements. In the subheadline right here, where it says "Come and witness our amazing mountain views," is only 1.82:1 color contrast ratio. Remember, we need to get that to 4.5:1 at least. And the button here is only 2.46:1, and we need to get that as well to 4.5. So here's our index.css, and I'm going to come down here and override just a couple elements. So first, we're going to target the paragraph element, which is in relation to this right here. And we're going to change that to a different color. Now, if we wanted maximum contrast, we would simply change it to black because this is a light background, but you don't always have to use black. I'm going to use this color code, 002A4E. I'll go ahead and save this. And now we can see it's coming out a lot better. Now, what about the background and foreground elements of the button itself? So we'll target A, which is the selector for it. Background, we'll say this is 006BC6. Now let's go ahead and save that. We can see now the button background now contrasts much better based on this background image here. And then still we have an issue with the foreground element of the button label text. So we'll use the color property and we'll just make this white. So now it contrasts much, much, much better. So in fact, after checking the color contrast, the subheadline up here is now a 7.6:1 color contrast ratio, which is great. And the button now is 5.3:1 color contrast ratio, which is above the baseline 4.51 AA rating. So contrast comes into play in more than just type elements. So as we proceed throughout this course, you're going to get a lot more experience with setting contrast. So just as with alignment, white space, contrast, and the other fundamentals, the size or the scale of every UI element must be carefully considered when you're designing. So just to show you an example, so we have this mini browser here, and we're going to go ahead and get this centered up. And there are a number of issues with this layout in terms of scale alone. Everything else seems to be pretty solid in terms of the other UI design fundamentals. There's good contrast, color, white space for the most part, but the scale of several areas is what we need to work on. So one area that we see that's quite lacking is this big open space over here. So the size or the scale of these cards is simply just too small for this given layout. We also see that there is not very much difference between the headline, our colors, and the subheadline beneath it. And we can also see that we can probably improve the scale, the size of the elements inside here, specifically referencing the type-based elements. So let's go ahead and see how much we can improve just the overall appearance and look of this design through adjusting scale alone. So first, we'll take a look at the index.html. It's very simple. We just have a color container class, and we're using the CSS grid to align these elements, and these are all the same essentially right here. So in the index.css, all the regular HTML is right here, and then we're just going to go ahead and override just a couple areas, and in fact, it's only 3 rule sets to get this looking better. So the first thing we'll take a look at is fixing this big area over here by adjusting the scale of the 3 cards on each row. So to do that, color container and grid template columns, and this is a property that we're overriding. It's defined up here, right here in this section. In fact, I'll go ahead and copy that and just paste it in. And we can see we have a repeat function of 3 columns at 150 pixels. So this doesn't really make sense. I don't think many people would do this, but I did just want to illustrate that sometimes people aren't using or won't utilize the entire space that's available in a given layout. So we're going to change that simply to auto. So when we make that change, we can now see it's much more filled out and it just looks so much better. But we can still make some other improvements. For instance, the H1 element. There's not much of a difference, like I said before, between these 2 elements. And so what's really suffering here is visual hierarchy. And we haven't covered visual hierarchy just yet, but we will. But you'll find out exactly how crucial scale is in terms of determining effective visual hierarchy. So let's fix the scale or the size of the H1 element. Font size. We'll do 2.2 EM, whereas before it was at 1.2. So we're increased it by 1 M unit. And look at that. That just looks so much better. And don't worry, at the end, I'll show you the before and then the after with our code so you can see the real difference between these 2. Now, let's also fix the scale of this element right here. I think this could definitely be improved. So let's come over here. The selector for that is P code, as in a color code, and it's font size 1.5 EM. Let's save that. So already we've made this larger and it just looks a lot better. And let's also make it bolder. And look at that. So now this layout really looks quite a bit better compared to what it looked like before. So let me show you the before, simply removing these rule sets. This is the before, and here is the after. It just looks so much better, and that's with the help of understanding and applying effective scale. Referencing the type-based elements. So let's go ahead and see how much we can improve just the overall appearance and look of this design through adjusting scale alone. So first we'll take a look at the index.html. It's very simple. We just have a color container class, and we're using the CSS grid to align these elements, and these are all the same essentially right here. So in the index.css, all the regular HTML is right here. And then we're just going to go ahead and override just a couple areas. And in fact, it's only 3 rule sets to get this looking better. So the first thing we'll take a look at is fixing this big area over here by adjusting the scale of the 3 cards on each row. So to do that, color container and grid template columns. And this is a property that we're overriding. It's defined up here, right here in this section. In fact, I'll go ahead and copy that and just paste it in. And we can see we have a repeat function of 3 columns at 150 pixels. So this doesn't really make sense. Help of understanding and applying effective scale. Welcome to the second design code challenge. So we can see this monstrosity in front of us in the mini browser. And yes, it is very, very ugly. In fact, it's the most ugly thing I've presented to you so far. And that's because we're going to be reviewing the UI design fundamentals that we've covered so far. And there's 4 of them. So white space, alignment, contrast, and scale. And that's what I want you to use in order to improve this and make it look 1,000 times better. It's sort of hard to imagine that we could make this much better, but with CSS properties, we certainly can and we will. So I want to take a look at the HTML first, just to describe what's happening. We have a div class of container, and that is a CSS grid just to get our cards organized here. We have a grid gap in here. And then we have our div class card. All this HTML is repeated twice right here. It's exactly the same. And the card itself is also a CSS grid with 2 columns, a span, which is in reference to this fake avatar right here, and also the div class content, which is the second column right here. So looking at the index CSS, this is all the regular CSS rule sets and properties to achieve what you see here. And then down at the bottom is where I want your solution to go. So in the comment, you can see your fixes will go in here. You don't have to use all of these rule sets. You can use more or less if you wish, but this is what my solution used essentially. And my solution also included using the following properties of width, background, padding, margin, text transform, font size, letter spacing, and color. Now, a couple of those like letter spacing and text transform, that's just a personal sort of preference that I added. You don't have to add that. And also, one thing that's very important to understand is that when it comes to design in general and UI design, certainly, there is a degree of subjectivity. So your result may look different than mine, but it still may be effective UI design. So hopefully you understand that. We're just focused on getting the objective criteria correct across those 4 UI design fundamentals. So go ahead and come up with here, using these rule sets and others if you wish, with a way to make this look better in terms of those 4 UI design fundamentals, and then come back. show you what I rule set here. So we're going to give it a width of 90%. Again, you could probably use cards are lacking in white space with the foreground elements and the text on top of it. We could also person have a little contrast 031. White space in pad date right here case out further. Preparing this lesson and other lessons, I do have a UI design application, Adobe XD or Adobe Experience Design, and I'm able to grab those values out. Let's also add a margin bottom of 0.4 EM here. All right, so it pushes it down slightly. Now, next up, we have an issue with alignment. So we have 0 on, and then also I want to change, we're going to do a pretty solid right now of 1.8 EM. Design fundamentals. So let's show, I'm going to show you the before and then this after again so you can really see the difference. So I'm going to simply remove all this. This is what it looked like. And this is what it looks like now. It is a massive difference. Let me do that one more time so that we can take this into free mode so that you can see what's happening here in real time as we adjust these. It's going from that to this. So much better. Good typography requires the understanding of other fundamentals, along with a few special considerations that are specific to typography itself. So those considerations are font choices. So generally speaking, when it comes to UI design and your font choices, you don't want to use more than 2 font families. In fact, most of the time you can get away with just 1. And also visual hierarchy. Now, this is one of the UI design fundamentals that we haven't yet covered, but we will very shortly. But in short, it's a way to establish the order of importance in terms of typography. So if you have multiple type-based elements like an H1 element or a paragraph element, then you use all of these other fundamentals in terms of your font size, your color and contrast, your font weights, to establish that visual hierarchy. And you'll see what I mean here in a second when we improve an example. Also, your font size, alignment, letter spacing, and line height, your font styles and color contrast, all of those work ultimately to create good typography if you understand how to apply them. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. I'm going to show the mini browser, and we're going to get it centered up here. And we can see we have this sort of testimonial section where we have 3 cards. And there's a lot going wrong here in terms of the typography. First, we have 3 different typefaces that are used in our testimonials. And we have this regular sans serif font here and here. And then we have a third typeface here where it says the author's name. There's also other issues in terms of the overall visual hierarchy. You're not really sure where you should be looking first because there's not one element that really stands out too much, or at least not enough. So let's go ahead and work with this and improve the typography as much as possible. So just a quick look at the index.html. We have a container with our testimonial section here and a subheading here. Then we have a section container, which serves as a CSS grid for a 3-column layout using these different cards right here. So in our index.css, here's all the regular CSS up top. We're importing 3 different fonts. And we're going to come down here to the bottom, and we're going to go ahead and make our fixes down here. So what we're going to do is first, I want to address the typefaces or the fonts that we're choosing. Like I said before, 3 in this type of context, 3 different fonts is simply too much. We're going to really stick to the basics and just use 1, and you'll see how much better it will look. So I'm going to target our H1, our paragraph, block quote, and cite elements. And we're going to simply say font family Montserrat. All right, so I've imported that font up here as well. So if we save this, we can see now we're all using the same font family, and it looks so much better. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is visual hierarchy. So right now, one of the elements that really stands out is the John Doe, but we'll fix that in a little bit. But really, we have to ask ourselves, what is the most important element that's a part of this user interface? And I would say it's the part right here where it's the H1 element, our testimonials, because it's informing people rather, exactly what this section's about. So we're going to head and increase that font size quite a bit. So we're going to say font size 2EM. All right, so now we've really established a little bit more visual hierarchy, a more effective visual hierarchy. Now, also, we do have something here in the next section. I'm going to say that our block quote paragraph section, we want to work with that just a little bit. It looks like the text here could be improved in terms of the line height. So we can make this a little bit more easier to read based on the current font size. So I'm going to say block quote P. We're going to say line height 1.5 EM. There we go. So it's been moved down a little bit, and it's just easier to read. Now, also, we have to deal with the unnecessarily large cite section right here. So we're going to use our cite selector, font size. We're going to make it significantly smaller because it's unnecessarily large. It's not a very important element. People, in this case, are just interested in what a person has to say about a given service and not about necessarily who they are. So that right there looks pretty solid in and of itself, but it is pretty small. So one way that you can kind of correct that, we could say font weight bold. So let's see what that does. All right, now it kind of sticks out a little bit too much. So we can use color and contrast to help maybe de-emphasize it and put it a little bit lower on the ladder of visual hierarchy. So what we can do is say color, and a color code will be 373737. And there we go. That looks pretty solid. So I'm going to show you a before and after. And this is just to show you, how important our fixes have been when it comes to typography. So this is the before. And here is the after. And once again, we'll go to the freeform mode. And I will show you what this looks like with the before and after. So hopefully you can see this fairly decently. So I'm going to get rid of it. It looks very ugly in terms of the type. And then here are our fixes, and it looks just so much better. The first UI design fundamental that really shapes a user's experience is color. Just think about it. When you visit a website or an app or a user interface of any sort, before you even are able to process and read any type of heading, for example, really your eye is exposed to color. And so color, in terms of a UI design fundamental, is extremely important. So, for instance, let's talk about color psychology very briefly. Each color depends to target demos. One thing that's a sure way to really just make a UI design that's otherwise, in terms of all the other UI design fundamentals, is great. Too many colors will really destroy. It's great. You can see how much good color. Another thing you want to avoid is using colors that don't really work well or complement each other well. These colors here, these three on the side, do not work well or contrast well with the colors here on the right. But if we keep the same three right here, we can certainly find different colors and lightnesses and darknesses of those colors that work well, just like here. As you can see, if we go back and forth, it just looks so much better to the eye. And then finally, we can also use slight variances of the same hue in terms of darknesses and lightness values to really reinforce different blocks of our layout. Okay, so with that said, I wanted to show you an example here where we can use the CSS properties to make this particular very ugly design a lot better. So as we can see, this where it says know your code, I mean, there's colors all over the place. Otherwise, it's pretty strong in terms of the UI design fundamentals. There's good white space, there's good scale, there's good visual hierarchy, there's good alignment. But there's not great contrast and there's not great color. That's the main thing that we need to fix. So with that said, let's go ahead and see what it would take just to make this look 1,000 times better. And remember, when it comes to color, there are millions of colors, right? That eye. So I'm going to come here in the index.html. We can see it's fairly simple. We just have a header element to see here right now. So what we'll do here in overwrites is to be one. Already looking a lot better just by changing one color. Also, we'll make our H1 element and paragraph element both white. And there we go. I mean, it's starting to look so... We've gone from form version. We went from... All right, welcome to this challenge where it's going to be completely based on color. So we could see this UI right here, and I intentionally made it all grayscale. And we could also see a key down here where you can kind of think of this as your color palette. These 5 colors are the only colors that you're allowed to use in order to give this UI design, this little contact form, a color scheme. And one thing you may be wondering about is how do I know what color codes? Don't worry, they're all in the CSS. I'll show you in a second. But you can also, when you choose your colors, you can go a light color scheme if you wish, or a dark one. In fact, I'm going to show you 3 different solutions I came up by only using these 5 colors here. So here's the HTML. You can see we have that little key legend area down here. There's just a regular contact form inside of a container. Nothing fancy is happening here. In our index CSS, here's all the regular CSS. And then we come down here to the bottom, and your fixes go below here. I want you to use these color codes. So you can see how there's a 1 next to each color code. That's in reference to the one right here. So the color code for number 1 would be the properties that you can use. Now, you don't have to use all these selectors. You don't have to use all the properties. You can use more properties if you wish, but really, I just want to focus on color. So try to use only color properties and your CSS rule sets. And so I'm going to once again show you exactly what I came up with. I'll have 3 different solutions, although you could potentially come up with more and they could be different and just as effective. But I just wanted to give you some ideas here. So go ahead and pause. Use these color codes. And here we go. We can see this one here works pretty well. Challenging. I may not provide you with any of the color going forward. So every element on a user interface has a level of importance, and clearly some elements are more important than others. So visual hierarchy is how we establish this importance, and we do it by utilizing the other UI design fundamentals that we covered previously. So I'm going to run through a few examples just to demonstrate how each of the other UI design fundamentals will help establish visual hierarchy in this example. So let's take a look at the first example. We can see there's no sense of visual hierarchy between these 5 different squares. They're all styled exactly the same, so they have equal importance. So if we take a look at the next slide, we can see now the eye is naturally gravitating towards this square as opposed to the other ones. So we've established some form of visual hierarchy through white space and alignment. Now going back to our original example, this example, we're using contrast in order to signify importance on this particular square. Now, in this example, we're using color to establish a visual hierarchy on this particular square. And here we're using scale to establish importance on this particular square as well. And finally, we can use multiple UI design fundamentals such as color, contrast, and scale together to really establish that this particular element is much more important than the others. And that is essentially what visual hierarchy is in terms of an abstract presentation. So let's get ourselves familiar with a real-world example of how visual hierarchy plays out in an actual example. So I'm going to go ahead and show the mini browser with a project example here. And here's just a submit form, basically, joining an email list. We see this commonly on different user interfaces. And this right here lacks good visual hierarchy because you're not exactly sure which text element you should be looking at. The call to action button doesn't really stick out very well. So this is lacking in good visual hierarchy, although in other areas of UI design fundamentals, it's pretty solid. So let's use some of the fundamentals that we learned in terms of design to establish a good visual hierarchy here. So just to take a look at the HTML, nothing exciting is happening here. Just an H1, we have a container, our form, along with a label, our input, paragraph, and finally the button. So here's the regular CSS rule sets and properties that we use to create this. And now I'm going to use these rule sets or these selectors in order to improve this overall. So the first thing I want to do is this H1 element, which is join the mailing list. This is a quite important piece of content in terms of informing the user about what this section here is underneath it. So we need to make that larger to really make it stand out the most. So we're saying that's the most important element. We're going to make this big. I'm going to say font size 3 EM units. All right, so now that's really sticking out. And so now we've kind of really improved the visual hierarchy of this design, but we're not just there and done yet. So our form container element, this right here, there's a form containing element that houses all of these HTML elements right here. And you can see it's kind of has some padding inside of it, but really to encase in and direct the eye to this area and establish visual hierarchy, I want to give it a little bit of a background. So what we'll do is just take a background, a color code that's just slightly lighter than the background it's sitting on. So it's in the same hue, it's just slightly lighter. All right, now that's looking really solid so far. Now the label and this piece of text are pretty much styled exactly the same. But really, in terms of importance, the email address is much more important than this label right here. So, notifying the unit bold. A lot of 1.2 design. It's just not sticking out to very much when it comes to UI design. And you have a single call to action, like a button. You want it to really stand out, and this just doesn't do the job really. So we're going to use color and a few other properties to really help reinforce the importance of that button. So first, font size. We're going to increase it just slightly to 1 EM. All right, so it's bigger there. All right, we're also going to take the background, and we're going to give it not a really a bright yellow, but kind of like a desaturated yellow. So that's FFED8C here. There we go. Of course, now we have an issue with contrast because you can make that bold because it is very important. This paragraph color in the app and just delete those side. So much better. All right, welcome to the visual hierarchy challenge here. So in front of us here is a simple card design that you might find on a layout. And there's issues with the visual hierarchy within this card design and even outside of it. And it's going to be your job in this challenge to improve the visual hierarchy using the CSS properties and rule sets that I've outlined in index.css. But before we get to that, here's the HTML file. I'm just using inline SVG rather for this element right here, this little down arrow. Then beneath that, we simply have the rest of the content, and nothing special is happening here. So we'll go to the index.css. Here's all the regular rule sets and properties to achieve what we see here. And then at the bottom, you need to fix the visual hierarchy by using these rule sets. You can use others if you wish. And also these properties, you can use others as well. Although this is what I chose for the solution that I'm going to show you in terms of what I came up with after you work on yours. So at this point, you can go ahead and pause, come up with your solution, just changing these auto properties to whichever values you think will improve the overall visual hierarchy using what you've learned in the visual hierarchy lesson. Go ahead and pause now and then come back. Would have there's around down arrow eye, and that's so quite there. Eyes paragraph, light term just that's, and then find a little bit like Mar taking this in a lot of directions. For instance, you could have taken this button, made the background green. It will. This is what we had before, and this is what we had after. And this is the after. As you can see, it just looks so much easier to read and it flows a lot better. Welcome to the final lesson that's a part of the UI Design Fundamentals chapter, and this is a coding challenge or a design challenge, really. And in front of you in the mini browser, we can see we have this layout. It's just white space, color, and alignment. So we're not using all of them, but those four are what we want to address. So let me show you first real quickly just the HTML that we're dealing with. Very simple. The body is actually a CSS grid container with a sidebar and a main element, and then all of our other information is inside of here. Now, if we go to the index.css, we can see all the regular rule sets used to achieve what we see here. And then at the bottom, we have your fixes below. Please keep the same background color. So that's in relation to this color right here. And also the sidebar color. I want you to keep those the same. That way we can at least end up in roughly the same result. Basic selectors here that I want you to use. There's only 3. And then I also have the properties that I want you to use for each of these, the color and padding, as well as H1 be maybe parameter here. The same thing, just so you can see the real before and after from that, which looks really bad, and to this. Congratulations on making it to the end of this UI Design Fundamentals course. Now, these are the UI Design fundamentals that we covered, and they're all equally important to get right. If UI design is lacking in just one of these areas, it seriously degrades the quality of the design. Now, if you ever try producing a UI design that just didn't look as good as you wanted it to, it's probably because it was lacking in one of these areas. Now, in the full UI Design Bootcamp launching shortly here on Scrimba, we're going to spend hours going through a variety of interactive examples and challenges to help build that necessary muscle memory that will help result in becoming a great UI designer. We're going to tackle many topics, including dark versus light UI design, responsive UI design, designing components, refactoring existing designs, creating full UI designs from scratch, and much, much more. So click on this link here to enter your email to receive sneak peeks from this upcoming course. And to also ensure you receive the best price possible when it launches. I'm Gary Simon, and I'll see you soon.